लोगों का सबका बहुत बहुत स्वागत। मुझे लगता है कि अगर हम लोग दिल्ली में सोचें कि 10 बजे से या 10:15 बजे से मीटिंग शुरू कर लें, इट विल बी a little ambitious. Delhi is a city of great distances, and it's very surprising that a friend of mine who could make from Kathmandu to Delhi, and the same time I took to come to this conference room from my residence. So on this note, आप लोगों का सब लोगों का बहुत बहुत स्वागत। ये 2 दिन की मीटिंग हम लोगों ने रखी है। जैसा कि आप लोगों में से ज्यादा लोग जानते होंगे कि बियॉन्ड कोपन कोलिशन एक जो हम लोग रिप्रेजेंट करते हैं उसकी एक स्ट्रेटेजिक प्लानिंग मीटिंग है, और 2 दिन के दौरान हम ये तय करना चाहते हैं कि कुछ ऑर्गेनाइजेशनल एस्पेक्ट्स पे चर्चा और एक स्ट्रेटेजिक डायरेक्शन पे चर्चा। लेकिन उससे पहले मुझे लगता है कि इट्स इम्पोर्टेंट टू लुक एट द बिगर पिक्चर, और ग्लोबल लेवल पे क्या हो रहा है क्लाइमेट चेंज और सस्टेनेबल डेवलपमेंट में, और नेशनल लेवल पे क्या हो रहा है, सब नेशनल लेवल पे क्या हो रहा है। वी विल लाइक टू स्टार्ट फ्रॉम देयर। वी आर वेरी हैप्पी टू हैव प्रोफेसर जयंता बंदोपाध्याय हियर. He is an academician, environmentalist, and an activist, and he has worked at IIM Kolkata for long years. So we will begin with a special lecture by Dr. Jayanta Bandyopadhyay on Himalayan rivers in South Asia, importance of ecology in a new policy, and then we will move on to second session, which looks at the bigger picture, and there we have 6-7 presentations from the experts in different areas. They will be joining us soon. तो एक बार आप लोगों का सब लोगों का बहुत बहुत स्वागत, और मुझे लगता है इट्स अ गुड टाइम टू स्टार्ट एंड अदर पीपल विल फिल्टर इन। तो प्रोफेसर जयंत बंदोपाध्याय।
Good morning to all of you. And it is a pleasure to be here to discuss what I consider is one major regional challenge of how Himalayan rivers need to be perceived, intervened, used, sustained for a ecologically secure, economically emerging South Asia. I was in Delhi for another meeting yesterday at the Ministry of Environment and Forests, but Vijay Pratap ji, who is a very old friend of mine, we have been together for long years since Lokayan days in early 80s, and he invited me to talk about what has been one of my research areas for the last 20-25 years, and hence I'm here. I'm delighted to be here with you, and thank for accommodating this lecture in your important program. So I'll be talking on the Himalayan rivers in general with respect to South Asia in particular, and among the diverse issues related to Himalayan rivers vis-a-vis South Asia, which includes issues of politics, regional politics, issues of new institutional framework for understanding water and intervening in it, the whole question of the delicate, complex Himalayan ecology and its understanding, the international political dimension of negotiations. There are many aspects, and they need a lot of time. I will address in this how ecological thought needs to be induced in our perception, understanding, framework for intervention in the Himalayan rivers, and in particular, again, not all Himalayan rivers are of the same character. In the river basin we are sitting in, the Ganga Brahmaputra Meghna river basin. So it is a focusing from a very large background of Himalaya, which provides water to a huge part of humanity, a very large part of Asia. It provides water to Shanghai in the east, provides water to Karachi in the west, and provides water to RLC in the north, Delhi, Dhaka, Kolkata in the south. Himalaya is world's largest producer of water. And the number of people that depend on Himalayan water and its various uses runs to about 2.5 to 3 billion people spread over China, India, Bangladesh, all highly populated, densely populated countries. So we have on the one hand the highest producer of water in the world, and we also have probably the highest needy people who need water. And this creates a complex challenge which we have not addressed properly, and I think in any futuristic sense this needs to be addressed. And since you are going to talk about climate change, I go back to 1991 when the preparations for the UN Conference on Environment and Development was going on. And I was then working at ICIMOD in Kathmandu, International Center for Integrated Mountain Development. And a group of 6 or 7, I would say the champions of the mountains, observed that the UNCED in Rio is going to have 3 major international conventions: the Biodiversity Convention, the Climate Change Convention, the Desertification Control Convention. But in the action program called Agenda 21, they had no action program on the mountains. Yet, the mountains are really the storehouse of biodiversity because of the high climatic diversity they offer. Mountains are the creator of deserts on the leeward side and windward side. Our neighbor, the people in Tibet, live in a desert, whereas we on the southern aspect of Himalaya have a reasonable affluence of water. If you go to any such mountain area, like the Andes have the big desert on the eastern side, they have a lot of water on the western side. So the 6 or 7 people approached the secretariat of the UNCED and said, "What are you doing? You have 3 conventions and you do not have an action program on the mountains," which are most directly, they are the biggest indicators of global warming. All you know, the glacial changes and other things. So good sense prevailed, and an opening came for introducing at a very late stage a chapter on the mountains in Agenda 21. And I had the opportunity of being asked to draft this chapter within a short period of 2 weeks, addressing the mountains of the world. And that is how came the chapter 13 in Agenda 21, which in the later years became one of the most effective and successful chapters, as a result of which the 5 years after, 10 years after Rio, the 2002 was declared as the International Year of the Mountains. So mountains are often neglected because people in the plains are in command always, as it is also equally true in the case of South Asia. But mountains have a tremendous significance, and that is why I would say that they need very serious attention. And what I want to submit to all of you right now is one small dimension of the attention needed. The attention needed is in many, many spheres, and I will, as I said, come to only the ecological dimension of the Ganga Brahmaputra Meghna river basin. You have equally the Indus basin, which has different ecological dimensions. You have many other rivers which are beyond South Asia, Himalayan rivers. They can be addressed equally by other regions, but as far as we are concerned here, we need to focus on the river basin we are in, top priority, and then look at other areas. So with that background, let me start the presentation I have brought. This is done rather quickly because I came for another meeting and I was requested to address here. So I have tried to put as much as possible, but probably in the discussion we can augment the gaps that may still exist. Now, Himalaya is also called the water tower for Asia. And the rivers originating in the Himalaya are crucial to many countries in Asia, including China and India. And I might say that in about 2 decades' time, China and India will exchange their position in the world ranking of population. India will become #1 in population. China has already peaked and its population is going down from about 1.38 billion. It is going down 1.35 and onwards to 1.2, their target. India will cross that, and by 2050, India will be 500 million more than China. So water is going to be more difficult in India than in China, though China has much less water. Now, if we see what is the Himalaya, much of the Himalayan region, including Tibet, belongs to China. The land belongs to China, but the water belongs to South Asia. Much of the water, and that is all produced on the southern aspect of the Himalaya. The northern aspect is the cold, dry desert of Tibet, where the precipitation drastically falls down. I'll come to that in a few minutes. So the southern aspect really creates the rivers, and hence South Asia is the recipient of the large amount of water. The biggest producer of water is Himalaya, and the largest chunk of what Himalaya produces comes to South Asia, whereas the largest chunk of land mass that produces this belongs to China. Now, this is the position of the Himalaya. It is the highest water producer of the world, and is called the water tower for Asia. The dark green is basically the upland called Himalaya, which includes the Tibetan Plateau and the Hindu Kush Himalayan region. And the rivers that emerge from the Himalaya are shown in blue, dark blue, the river basins. You can see that the cradle of Chinese civilization, the Yellow River, emerges from the eastern extreme of the Himalaya. The cradle of the Indian civilization, the Ganga, and also Indus, the cradle of the Indus civilization, they all originate from a very nearby area around Mount Kailash. Ganga on the southern aspect, Indus on the northern aspect, and Yarlung Zangpo, a tributary to Brahmaputra, also originates somewhere nearby to the east, flowing to the east. Now you can see that Ganga and Brahmaputra and Indus, which are draining the southern aspect of the Himalaya, are really feeding South Asia. And we have enormous importance of other rivers, the Yangtze, the Yellow River, their lifelines of China, but we will not go into. Mekong is the lifeline of Southeast Asia. We will not go into that. We will talk about specifically the Ganges, Brahmaputra and Meghna river basin. Now, in South Asia has a water availability which is above the world average. And about 70% of India's river flows comes from the Himalayan rivers, Ganga, Brahmaputra, Meghna, and the Indus. So for India, Himalayan rivers are very, very important. 70% of our water flows are in those rivers. But in spite of having above average water availability and liberal supply of Himalayan waters, equally 70% of our people do not have sanitation. 10% of every 10th Indian do not have safe drinking water, as a result of which, you know, millions of children die every year from just non-availability of safe drinking water. And this is after 67 times the Jhanda has been going up on the Lal Killa. It's a difficult truth for all Indians, but it is true. This is the breakdown of our rivers flows. You can see that Ganga, Brahmaputra, Meghna, and if you add the Indus, it is providing the largest. And we have a substantial amount of flow in India on the Western Ghat, western flowing rivers, but they hardly have any direct.
So what's the green one?
That is the west flowing rivers. I am talking of that is the rivers flowing directly back to Arabian Sea from the western slope of the Western Ghats. And bring the map next. They are a substantial amount of flow, but unless you invest heavily and ecologically damaging projects, you cannot really use them. I will come to this just for your answering. If you can see on the western side, you have a very dense blue line, which is high precipitation line. But for the mainland of the country, that precipitation is of not much use because it goes back to Arabian Sea.
Sorry, could you please go back to the previous slide? It's about 60% UVM.
Yeah, if you add the Indus, it comes roughly to 65 or so. 70 is the round figure I give. Now, what is the challenge of water management? If this amount would have been, our availability would have been equally distributed in space and time, our water management would have been very simple, because the task of water management has been to fit the human requirements with the natural availability. And the natural availability is highly skewed in both space and time. If our spatial and temporal availability of water would have been less skewed, I'm not saying absolutely equally uniformly distributed, water engineering would be much simpler in this subcontinent. But it is not the case. Now I come to the location of our central area of discussion, the Ganga Brahmaputra Meghna basin. This probably is a map well known to all of you. And, on the left hand side you have the Ganga basin. On the right side you have the Yarlung Zangpo turning through the Great Gorge, entering into India. First it is called Siang, then it is called Dihang, and as number of rivers, small rivers, starting from Buri Dihing to Lohit to Dibang and Dihang meet near Pasighat, Brahmaputra is born. And that Brahmaputra then flows all the way through to West Bangladesh, meets the Ganga in the name of Yamuna. In Bangladesh, it is Brahmaputra has 5 names. Yarlung Zangpo on Tibet, then you have Siang, then you have Dihang, then you have Brahmaputra, which is Brahmaputra Valley of Assam, and as it enters Bangladesh, it's called in Bangla Jamuna. And Jamuna meets the Ganga and then flows through Bangladesh, meets the Meghna, and finally it is Meghna, the name which is the total drainage of this large river basin. Now, what is the challenge of this temporal and spatial inequities in precipitation? The annual precipitation is highly skewed in space and time. 11,600 millimeters in Meghalaya. There are lots of locations now beyond Cherrapunji, around Cherrapunji, within 50 kilometers of Cherrapunji, which records more than 11,600 millimeters annual. And if you go to the eastern limit of the Ganga Brahmaputra Meghna basin in Rajasthan, you will find areas with 200 millimeters of annual rainfall. So on one hand you have 11,600, on the other hand you have 200 millimeters. This is the spatial inequity. And it is also highly skewed in time, with 80% of the total precipitation falling during July to September, the monsoon period. Now this is the precipitation map of the country. You can see the color difference between Rajasthan and the northeastern states, particularly very densely blue areas around Meghalaya hills, as well as on the western slope of the Western Ghats. And exactly the way if you cross the Western Ghats, you come to the rain shadow area of eastern slope of the Western Ghats, and where water is fought over. Every river basin is in the Supreme Court, particularly the Krishna, Kaveri, all flowing from the drier areas of Western Ghats through highly populated plains. Whereas on the western side of the Western Ghats, we have very large rivers quickly going back to the sea. So this is the great spatial inequity. What is the nature of the problem with our water engineering concepts with respect to the Himalayan rivers? How to fit this spatial and temporal inequity with almost sort of uniform demand of human settlements, almost uniform demand of industry, and irrigation-specific demand of agriculture. So on one side we have a demand pattern which is something, we have a supply pattern which is something else. Engineering's role has been how to match these two. The paradigm of the present day water engineering in South Asia is dominated by the British tradition. You know that our really water engineering's Makkah is IIT Roorkee. And IIT Roorkee earlier was University of Roorkee. University of Roorkee earlier was Thomson Engineering College. Thomson was a British engineer who started the engineering college, and that British tradition has remained very much into the academic blood of our engineers. This has two things. One is that through the British rule, we had taken the whole British concept of water management, and the local knowledge and local institutions of water management were then marginalized by the British. Exactly the way when British medicine came up, the traditional medicines were found or declared to be non-practicable. We had to bring back Ayurveda in free India. So exactly the way the British took over the management of waters, and the traditional knowledge and traditional institutions were marginalized. Now I continue with the discussion on the problems of our water engineering. Now this marginalization and domination of the British engineering aspects led to the practice of water engineering that aimed at irrigation, because the British wanted more irrigation. As you know, if those who are from Bihar, the whole issue of indigo cultivation, those who are in other parts, the irrigated higher products brought in higher returns to the government. So irrigation dominated the idea of intervention in water management. And there are many aspects of this: socioeconomic, political, institutional, knowledge-oriented. In this lecture, I will address, as I mentioned earlier, the ecological aspects, because they are very neglected, and I would like to put up some of them into a larger public attention. Now, the distribution of the monsoon creates a river flow pattern that is reflecting the precipitation pattern. And in addition to water, the Himalayan rivers also carried substantial amount of sediment load and high energy that make the river hydrology very dynamic. Unlike the European rivers, Himalayan rivers have a very, very different character, which engineers of the European philosophy of river management often see as unwanted. For example, when we have the peak flow in the monsoon, in the traditional sense, they were never called a disaster. They were called high flow periods, Chaumasa, where you will have larger inundation, but they were not seen as disasters. I always refer to one example that Kosi was declared as the river of sorrow, and Kosi river basin was seen as an area of disaster. But upstream of Kosi, you have the kingdom of Janakpur, Maharaja Janak's kingdom. And if it was such a devastated area, why princes from all over the subcontinent came to get married to Sita? There must be some misunderstanding somewhere. If it is a flourishing kingdom of a powerful king with all fertile lands and good production, only then people will come there. This is the problem, that Britishers could not understand the monsoon high flow, and they always say this is a disaster. Floods are not always a disaster. Floods have both positive sides and negative sides. In fact, the word flood, I would like to get replaced by annual monsoon inundations. That is one aspect of the UK-based hydrological understanding of the Himalayan rivers. In addition to water, the Himalayan rivers carry a huge amount of sediment. Ganga, Brahmaputra, Meghna carries the world's largest annual sediment load into the Bay of Bengal. Whereas if you go to any European rivers, you will not find any major sediment. Himalaya, battered by monsoon, generates a huge amount of sediment. In Europe, you neither have the monsoon nor have the unstable Himalayan type mountain system. And in your whole planning of rivers, if you ignore sediment, I am going to show that you are going to be counterproductive, and that engineering is going to be a definite failure. Now this is a comparison of a European river and Yamuna in Delhi, where we are sitting. The The tall figures are the average monthly flow in Jamuna, and the white are the average monthly flow in Thames in Oxford. The dark ones is the number of rainy days in Oxford, and the blue ones are the number of rainy days in Delhi. Now you can see how uniform. This is the demand and supply almost coincides. You don't need special engineering knowledge to meet the demand and the supply. Whereas in the case of Jamuna in Delhi, you have a precipitation pattern which is very skewed, as I said, in temporal manner, and hence you have this peak. Now when all these rivers come, and as you have seen in the map, ultimately, let us see what is the situation in Bangladesh. When Brahmaputra enters Bangladesh, the Ganges, Ganga enters Bangladesh, what is the situation? Now remember this hydrograph, this is the precipitation. Almost similar is the flow that enters Bangladesh. This is the Ganga at Hardinge Bridge, immediately after it enters from West Bengal to Bangladesh, and Brahmaputra at Bahadurabad as it enters from Assam to Bangladesh. And you can see same amount of peaking and leaning. The 3 months in Brahmaputra and 2.5 months in Ganga. Brahmaputra peaks early because it has a large area under snow and ice. So with the spring coming, Brahmaputra's flow starts to go up. Ganga doesn't have that amount of snow and ice, but it has larger amount of monsoon precipitation, and it starts going up only in June. But this inequity is a major important thing. Inequity in time. So as a result, what happens? On the Rajasthan side, people are spending all their life to keep the pitcher on their head full of water. 200 millimeters is the local rainfall, every drop is wanted, and Rajasthan had its traditional ways. Anupam Mishra has written extensively on these indigenous technologies. But the question is, on one hand, we have people struggling to keep water on the top of their head. On the other hand, this is in Dhubri, people are struggling to keep water below their feet. It is a highway full of water in the annual, regular annual inundation. So this stark difference in our behavior is very different from the behavior of Thames in Oxford, which is uniform. So this, I continue with the problems with our water engineering. The differences in the ecohydrology of rivers in the UK and what I showed in terms of Oxford and Thames is almost uniform for most of Europe. And the Europe-specific water knowledge will not be applicable, and we need a Himalaya-specific water knowledge. But what has happened is, in post-independence India, especially after Farakka, and a difficult situation of a large dam building with Nepal, India's Himalayan rivers hydrological data has been kept as a, I would not say restricted. You can get access to it, you can have a look at it if you have strong official backup, but you cannot publish anything. You cannot report that in your scientific papers. So those who have access to those data are not able to interpret and publish anything out of that data.
So are you referring to rainfall data? What data is this?
Pardon me?
What hydro data is this? Rainfall or something else? Or river flows?
River flows.
River flows.
Micro level river flows. Annual river flow you can get. But in your understanding of rivers, that is not that important. You have to get at least 10-day averages, if not daily. And that data you cannot openly use and publish. So the river science has been it has remained in a state of underdevelopment because of the official restrictions. Now, whether it is in the national interest to keep the data confidential, or it is in the national interest to develop water science for Himalayan rivers, is our choice. We have approached the Prime Minister, but didn't get much positive response. Even under the right to information, you cannot get into hydrological data of Himalayan rivers. So 70% of our water resource or water flows in the rivers, you have no access to data. And hence the science is very, very backward. The other problem is, especially in the Ganga Basin. Ganga Basin is the world's densest populated river basin. It has tremendous pressure on water, but we do not have a good science to back up water engineering. But the pressure is increasing every year. These are the two specific periods, and the pressure is increasing every year in the Ganga Basin. It is the world's densest populated river basin. We tend to take pride in being number one on all bad things. We cannot manage, but we say this is the densest populated river basin. We will soon become world's number one, but only in population and not in economy. So we do not bother much about not being number one in economy, but number one in population makes us, some people, happy. So population is a major problem of South Asia, but Ganga Basin in particular. And here is the paradox of water and economic development. Traditional concepts of economics where scarcity brings value, scarcity brings price. In dry areas, poverty and lack of water gets very easily correlated by economy. But in South Asia, that theory falls apart. Here we have the largest number of poor people of the world, with one of the heaviest rainfall area. It is not African poverty where water scarcity leads to poverty. It is abundance of water, and yet we have the world's largest number of poor people. So not only a new engineering, but a new economic concept has to come, which have not evolved so far. I would now call the European-oriented engineering as the traditional engineering, and traditional engineering interventions were guided by priority of irrigation. As I said, the whole interest of the British East India Company and later the direct colonial rulers were to get more production from land, and hence irrigation was the main purpose of water related interventions. So storage comes in because you have to irrigate, and extension of canal is storage and extension of canal are just two sides of the coin. You cannot only store water, you have to distribute it. In the last 25 to 30 years, we have a different type of engineering intervention in the Himalaya, which is no less serious and in my opinion is probably more extensive. That is the hydropower. I will come to the mapping of the hydropower generation units, and one has to really look at what it is capable of doing to the whole riverine ecosystems. Now the success of Indian irrigation is well known. Here are the two things. One is almost immediately after independence, and another one is more recently. you can see that the greening, this irrigation greening, the lower side, is at a very mature stage compared to what we inherited in the period of our independence. And that is all because of the structural intervention of dams and canal systems. And this is the map of the command areas in the country. And you will see that Himalayan rivers are really the sources of large command areas in the Ganga and Indus systems. The bulk of the command area of the country is there. And in the Ganga basin, you can see the rivers have been overwhelmed by the canals. Rivers are in blue lines, canals are in brown lines. And they are at the point of their coming from the mountains to the plains. We have the barrages, the Sarda barrage, the Gandak barrage, all the way down to the east, the Kosi barrage, and they irrigate huge areas. So this map shows how intensely Ganga basin has been irrigated because of the irrigation priority given by the British water managers. What future with this traditional engineering and business as usual? The traditional water engineering has identified that this country has a total water, it is like debit credit in the banks. You have a total amount of 11 and 22 billion cubic meter of water that the country can use. And we are pretty far off from that. We are at 700, 800 billion cubic meter at the moment. But if you go to 2050 and business as usual economic growth, everyone is talking of that we should get back to 7 to 8% economic growth. More enthusiastic people in the election fray are talking of 9% economic growth. If all that has to occur, you need water.
So this is the South Asia or?
This is for India. Indian positive side is 1122, but if you see business as usual, 2050, our demand is already crossing the availability. So 1180, and if you want to live beyond 2050 and without changing the institutions of water, you will have 1200, 1300, 1400, we will go into a water war. Because availability is far lower than total demand, there will be lot of friction, lot of tension, maybe lot of fights. So we have to have preventive systems which are more institutional, legal, as well as ecological. Now, water demand is going to be increasing, and so what do we do? What do we do beyond say 2040, 2045 to prevent us being overtaken or water demand overtaking the water supply? Is there a possibility of new storages? And if you have to increase 1122 to higher, how far can you go? And can engineering offer any solution with the enhanced supplies that are ecologically and socially acceptable? Now, we know that storage dams are always fraught with local opposition because of the way we have mishandled water projects. We have tried to rob people of their land and their livelihoods and not given them at all a good rehabilitation and a package to minimize the costs or just to neglect the poor people. How do you go? Do we enhance more storages? Do you have any other ways? No one is talking about these, and I think with this added by the uncertainty of global warming and climate change, these are different things. Global warming will melt the glaciers and raise the sea level, climate change will reduce or change the precipitation pattern. A lot of people mix global warming and climate change. You have to be really clear. Global warming is the reason, climate change is the effect as much. Global warming is the reason, melting of glaciers is the effect. Global warming is the reason, sea level rise is the effect because of thermal expansion of the ocean water. Climate change is only one impact of global warming, which comes from greenhouse gas concentrations. So if climate change occurs, there will be more uncertainty in our availability of water. So a complex situation becomes much more complex with climate change coming in, and the whole economic future, social future of South Asia is probably directly connected with how we address the usual ecological issues of Himalayan rivers and the unusual ecological issue of changes that global warming and climate change brings in. Going back. Okay, good. We need to restart this. Okay. Now here we come to the idea that the huge amount of monsoon flow can be obstructed by large storage dams, and A, you have the advantage of controlling floods, and B, the stored water can then be used after the monsoon. But the storage in the Himalaya sites are identified. On the left, the maroon column is the total flow of, say, Ganga. In this case, we are talking of the Ganges, the Ganga. About 500 BCM is its flow. Right now, the available storage is very small, minuscule, the green one. It cannot change the flood conditions at all. If we have all the dams built, designed in India, that is the middle, deeper blue, you will have about 8% of the total flow which you can store. And if we have all the mega dams, including those in Nepal, which includes Kosi High